We are continuing our series, What Would Jesus Do? We've just done a bunch of messages on the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew chapter 5, chapter 6, and chapter 7. We've done at least three messages in each chapter, and just looking at this great message that Jesus did. And now Jesus has just finished the Sermon on the Mount. He's come off the sermon, coming off that mountain. It's about an hour walk from where he gave that message, and he's come back to Capernaum, and that is his headquarters in Galilee. That is where he would come and get his rest, and then go back out into Galilee and do his ministry. And so he is basically back in Galilee, and so an interesting thing happens. But before we get there, I want to talk about what we call the rise of the nuns. Now, this is not Catholic nuns, N-U-N-S. This is the rise of the nuns, N-O-N-E-S. And these are the people that check the box nun that when they're doing surveys that say they're not religious or they're not active religiously. And the nuns are now about 23% of the adults in the United States. And back in 2007, it was 16%, and it's now rose to 23%. Almost 1 in 4 adults in America say they are not religious whatsoever. And that's a pretty big increase, and it's really hitting our younger people. The millennials are making up about 36% of the nuns. And so you can think of it, for every person who goes from not being religious to becoming a Christian, there are 4 people who say they grew up in Christian homes but are now not religious, is what our surveys are telling us. And so what's fascinating, though, of these nuns, these people who say they're not religious, only 3% say they are atheists. That's fascinating to me. They say they're not religious, but only 3% say they are atheists. They all consider themselves basically spiritual. That's the big term today. They say they're spiritual. And many of them will say they respect Jesus. They would be friendly to Jesus. Now, have they really did a deep dive into Jesus? No. They've heard stories maybe about Jesus. They like some of the teachings they've heard about Jesus. They would paint Jesus with broad brushstrokes, like Jesus is always loving. That's the kind of thing Jesus is always forgiving. They would make wide brushstrokes, and they just don't believe in him as Lord. And one of the things we're going to see today is that they don't like the authority of making Jesus Lord. In fact, one of the things that the younger culture doesn't like is they don't like anything that is too much authority. They just don't like anything that says this is the right way. They don't like rules. And that's one of the problems they have with religion, and that's one of the problems they have with anybody that says Christ has to be Lord and he is in complete dominance of your life. And so over the next 5 weeks, we are going to look at 5 stories in the seventh chapter of Luke, and we're going to look at 5 different things that I think if the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, would look at Jesus in these 5 stories, they would see a different kind of Jesus than what they think of. And tonight we're going to look at the authoritative side of Jesus and see how I think they misconstrue the authority side of Jesus. And so we're going to be looking at today Luke chapter 7, verses 1 through 10. And this is one of the 5 scenes where a Roman centurion has a sick slave, and he wants Jesus to heal that. And then we're going to look at the Lord coming across a funeral procession of a grieving widow. Then we're going to see where John the Baptist is struggling with doubt. One of my favorite stories in the Bible, that John the Baptist has doubt about Jesus being the Messiah. Then we're going to look at a conversation between the Lord and some crowds traveling with him. And then we're going to end with the Lord visiting a Pharisee's house and a sinful woman washing his feet. And so we're going to be looking at those stories in the coming weeks. And these stories give us a window into seeing Jesus in 5 different ways and just realizing that Jesus fills all of our needs. And if the nuns could see just how incredible Jesus is, I think they would try to make him Lord. And so that's what we're hoping to do in these 5 messages. So what does the Bible say? And that's what we're going to be looking at. What does the Bible say? And we as Christians believe the Bible is our guidebook. All right. Here's what we start here in verse 1 and 2. It says, when Jesus had finished saying all this to the people, he returned to Capernaum. And at that time, the highly valued slave of a Roman officer was sick and near death. Now, he had just finished doing the Sermon on the Mount. This story is also in Matthew chapter 8, verses 5 through 13. That Matthew story is more of a synopsis, and this is more detailed. This is more detailed story than Matthew's story, okay? And he's gone back to Capernaum, and like I said, he's just finished the Sermon on the Mount, and most translations will say that this guy is a Roman centurion, and our text says a Roman officer, but the real terminology is a Roman centurion, and he would have been a commander of about 100 men, and a legion would have been about 6,000 men, and it would have been broken up into 60 units of 100 men, and a centurion would have been over those 100 men. And centurions would have been the backbone of a Roman army. And they were long service, regular soldiers of the Roman army, and they were responsible for the discipline of the regiment, and they were the cement of the legion of soldiers. They were typically about the finest men in the Roman army. Now in Capernaum, I've been to Capernaum twice, and it's at the north end of the Sea of Galilee, and it had a bustling business there. And you go, why would there be Roman soldiers there? Well, there had been 2 reasons. One, to guard the population against illegal business and criminal activities. But another reason would be to collect taxes and customs from traders who crossed the borders into Palestine, because that would have been like the first major city when they came into Palestine, because the trail, the road that came in where you would have headed towards, say, Jerusalem and into other towns, would have started when you came into the Israel, would have came right through Capernaum. That's where they would have wanted to get their taxes and customs, and so they had soldiers there. Now, centurions are mentioned 3 other times in the Bible, and all 3 places they're mentioned positively. One is at the cross when Jesus is crucified, Cornelius in Acts chapter 10, and Julius in Acts chapter 27. And so it's surprising that Roman soldiers could be real rough, mean, coarse guys, and yet every time a centurion is mentioned in the Bible, they are very kind and honest men. And so let's go on. In verse 3, it says, when the officer heard about Jesus, now how would he have heard about Jesus? Daily gossip. Daily gossip. I mean, Capernaum, everything was happening there. You had traders coming from the south, you had traders coming from the north, and they heard about everything coming through Capernaum. And so this officer would have heard about Jesus. He sent some respected Jewish elders to ask him to come and heal his slave. Now that's kind of fascinating that he asked Jewish elders. Typically, you would not have had Jewish elders and a Roman soldier that tight-knit. This is not normal, and yet he asked them to go tell Jesus to come and heal his slave. And so they earnestly begged Jesus to help the man. Now, here's why they asked. It says, if anyone deserves your help, he does, they said, for he loves the Jewish people and even built a synagogue for us. Now, we're not positive, this is in Capernaum, we're not positive if he built the synagogue in Capernaum because it doesn't tell us which synagogue he built. But it's clear that he had a relationship with the Jewish people. They liked him, he liked the Jewish people, and he, out of his own money, had built this synagogue. And so when he said, hey, I hear this Jesus heals people, can you go talk to him on my behalf? They said, sure. So there had to be a really close a relationship between him and them. Now, there's a couple of things we learn about this guy. One is, it says he loved his slave. That's pretty cool. So, as I said, there's 4 times. I've given you 3 already. This is one of the 4 times that a centurion is mentioned. And it says that he loved his slave. And so that's impressive. And we saw that in verse 2, that his slave was highly valued by him and was sick and about to die. And so he really cared about his slave. And then he loved the people that he was watching. In verses 4 and 5 here, they said about him, he's worthy for you to grant this because he loves the Jewish people. And so he had a lot of respect. So he was a good guy, just like the other 3 times we read about the centurions in the Bible. Verse 6 tells us even more about him. So Jesus went with them. But Jesus, before they arrived at the house, the officer sent some friends to say, Lord, don't trouble yourself by coming to my home, for I am not worthy of such an honor. I'm not even worthy to come and meet you. Just say the word from where you are, and my servant will be healed. That's pretty cool. When it says I'm not worthy, can be expressed in the Greek, I'm not good enough, I'm not important enough. Now, he's a centurion. He's got rank. He's got people that do whatever he says. He's got authority, and yet when speaking to Jesus, even though he sends somebody in his place, he says, I'm not important enough. I don't deserve. Or it could be rendered in the Greek, you are too important to come to my house. So he is very respectful of Jesus. That's pretty cool for this guy to think that highly of Jesus, which means he's a very humble man, even though he's attained a place of honor. And then we see in verse 8, it explains how he understands how authority works. He says, I know this because I'm under the authority of my superior officers, and I have authority over my soldiers. I only need to say, go, and they go, or come, and they come. And if I say to my slaves, do this, they do it. And so he understands that just his words commands people to do. And if a soldier hears that he said to do something, they do it because of his authority that's been granted to him from Rome. And so he is conveying to Jesus that kind of authority. And so he just says, you don't even have to come to my house. Just speak where you are, and it can be done. And so this guy gets it. And he recognized that Jesus could command anything in creation, and it would obey. Now, we're going to do this question here, and then we'll come back into the story again. So, here's the question. How can you make yourself more valuable to your employer? Obviously, this slave was valuable to this centurion. Now, slaves in those days would be slightly different than slaves that were here in America. Slaves back then could be very trusted and honored in a society. In the Roman society, you could have been a doctor and been a slave. And so slaves were treated, there were slaves that were mishandled in the Roman society, but you could be a slave and be well respected in society. But how can we make ourselves more valuable to our employer, as this slave obviously was valuable to this centurion? Talk about that and then come back and we'll get more into this story. So what does this passage say about Jesus? We always want to know, what does this passage say about God, Jesus, or the Holy Spirit? And so what does this passage tell us about Jesus? Well, it tells us that Jesus is caring. I love in verse 6, it says that Jesus went with them. Now, these guys come up to him, and these elders, he might have known these elders if they came from Capernaum, because this was his home base. Jesus taught out of the synagogue in Capernaum. I mean, you know, when we go to Capernaum, we stand in the synagogue. It's a newer synagogue than the one that Jesus was in, but we're standing in the exact same space where Jesus would have taught. And so Jesus might have known these elders, but he doesn't know the centurion. He doesn't know this slave. And they come and say, hey, this guy's a slave is sick. He's near death. Will you come and help him? And he goes, sure. So he cares. He went to see a sick and dying person, and he cares. He's sensitive to our needs. Second, he appreciates our faith. Look at verse 9. We had read up to verse 8, and it says, when Jesus heard this, he was amazed. Turning to the crowd that was following him, he said, I tell you, I haven't seen faith like this in all Israel. Now, he's got Jewish people with him, and when these friends come and meet him and they say, hey, the centurion, you're Jewish, and we know that Jews really don't like to go to Gentiles' homes, and he doesn't feel like he's worthy for you to come to his home, and you can just speak from where you are now, and his slave can get healed. Jesus is just like, wow, I've not seen this. In fact, when it says that he was amazed, another word there can be marveled, and the word in the Greek there is only used once here, and it's used in Mark 6:6. And that is from a different experience when Jesus was in Nazareth, and the people there heard him teach when he was in the when he was teaching in the synagogue, and the people were so amazed at his teaching, and yet they were like, isn't this Joseph and Mary's kid? And he was so amazed, or he marveled at their unbelief, that they couldn't get over how great a teacher he was, but they were still going back to his earthly parents. and he was shocked at their unbelief. Here the word is used on the opposite spectrum, that he was amazed or marveled at their belief. So this is only 2 times in Scripture where the word is used that Jesus marveled, and he's just marveled. So Jesus appreciates when you and I show great faith. And then we see that Jesus answers prayer. Verse 10 says, when the officer's friends returned to the house, they found the slave completely healed. Now, Luke is a doctor. He's a doctor. And he uses a word that's stronger than Matthew. Matthew said he was healed, but the word here that Luke says that he was extremely well. It just wasn't he was healed, he was very well. He was in great condition. And so Luke doesn't tell us anything else about that. He just said, hey, Jesus healed this guy into where he was in great shape. He was very well refreshed. And so Jesus answered this guy's prayer. And this is like the only place where we see this in Scripture, where Jesus heals a guy long distance, almost everywhere. Now, Jesus healed people differently. Sometimes he would touch a guy. Sometimes he would take spittle, they would say, and into the mud and put it in someone's eyes. Sometimes he would just touch the eye. And I think he did it a bunch of ways, because we always get caught up on how he does it. And if he did it one way every time, we would always say that's the way it has to be done. So Jesus always healed differently for a reason, so we don't get caught up on how he healed. But this is like the only time where he just speaks it, and in a long distance somebody gets healed, which is kind of cool. All right? So let's go to the third of the 4th questions. Why do you think the centurion's faith amazed Jesus, and does faith in other people amaze you? Talk about that in your hotspot, and then come on back and we'll finish this up on how we can obey. All right, so how can we obey? And that's what we always want to know here as Christians. How can we obey something from this passage? Well, first of all, we need to look out for the welfare of others. Here was a guy, this whole story is the centurion not looking out for himself, isn't it? He's looking out for a slave of his that he highly values. And so we need to be looking out for other people and be concerned about their needs and how to help them. And that's what this story is all about. And then we need to go big in our prayers. This guy got it. He says, Lord, you don't even have to come here. You can just speak it, and it can happen. And so he went big in his prayers and what he asked God to, or asked Jesus to do. And you and I need to do that. I feel like one of my biggest faults is sometimes I will pray, Lord, if it's your will, you can do this, but I don't really ask it. You know, it's just like, is this too big of an ask? Is this too big? And I need to be a little bit more, let's go for it. And Lord, I'd like you to do this. If it, you know, especially if it's not for me. Lord, this, you know, this is your child. I know you love them. This is one of yours. And I'm going to ask that you do this. And just go big. It doesn't hurt. And so what is the takeaway here? Well, as I said earlier, one of the issues that millennials, like I said, the younger crowd has with Christianity, religion, and making Christ Lord. They don't like that terminology. We make Christ the Lord. He is the boss. He is the king of our lives. They don't like when we make a statement where somebody has that kind of authority over us. They don't like that. And what we need to realize is, first of all, this talks about the kind of authority that Christ had, that he could just speak things and it happens. We also need to realize that the authority that God has is always for our good. Now, this is just a side note, but hopefully it sheds light on the bigger picture. We know from every study we do, I want you just to hear this. Every study we do of children from conservative parents that has rules, boundaries, and guidelines, curfews, rules. Now, I'm not talking about parents that beat their kids. I'm talking about parents that have that disciplines their children and has guidelines, rules, boundaries, like I said, curfews. They have rules. Those kids have less anxiety and they're happier and have more joy than kids that have the full run and freedom of the house. Are you with me? So the more, when a kid has rules that make sense and they have rules, they know their parents love them because their parents love them enough to give them boundaries. So when we say that God gives us boundaries, there's not a rule that God gives us that's not for our benefit. There's not a rule, a law, or a commandment that God gives us that's not for our benefit. It helps us. It keeps us out of trouble. As the writer of Hebrews says, sin is fun for a season, and then it takes you down. And there's a price to pay for sin. And we just need to realize that everything God tells us to do is for our benefit. And so when you think about God's authority, the Bible makes it very clear that He loves us and He gives us rules and boundaries to help us, to keep us out of trouble because He loves us. And He is the perfect Father, and that's what we want people who are nuns, who check, I'm not religious, we want them to know, yes, God, we want to make Christ our full authority. We want God to have full control of our lives, but it's because He cares for us and because He loves us, and it's in our best interest. And when you get that, then you can genuinely trust God with everything of your life. And if you do that, that should be your takeaway, that you can trust Jesus with everything. And so I hope that makes sense to you. And you think about that this week. And if you're not a follower of Christ, please contact us here at the office. We would love to talk with you, have a conversation, and share with you on how you can give your life and just follow Jesus. And so think about that as you strive to become more like Christ, as we study the Bible, serve others, and share our faith together. So what can you do to build your faith in God and help others find faith in Him?
Feel free to contact Crosswaves and tell us all about your experience. We would love to hear from you. Send us your prayer requests or questions about the Bible or Crosswaves Church. To keep up to date, visit our Facebook page and subscribe to the Crosswaves YouTube channel. We want to take a minute and say thank you to all you who donate online or send checks to Crosswaves Church through our app or website. Thank you for being a generous Christian and fueling the mission to reach more and more people for Christ.
You know what time it is? You know what time it is? Do you know what time it is? Joke of the week, joke of the week. Well, we only promise 3 out of 10 jokes are actually funny. This week's joke is from Kenny Graham right here at the studio. Kenny Graham right here at the studio. All right. Here we go. Johnny goes to the pet shop. And he's looking for a new pet, and the pet shop owner says, hey, I've got a talking centipede. And I'll give it to you for a good price. And Johnny goes, man, there's no way that you have a talking centipede. Centipedes don't talk. And the owner says, man, I'm promising you, this is a talking centipede. So Johnny says, okay, man, I'm going to trust you. And he buys this talking centipede. So later that evening, Johnny goes up to the tank where the centipede was, and he says, hey, bud, I'm going down to the store. You want to go with me? And the centipede said, nothing. Not a word comes from the centipede. And Johnny's just frustrated. And he just goes to the store by himself. He goes alone. So the next day, Johnny thought, well, I'll give this centipede another try. So he goes up to the tank again. He says, hey, buddy, I'm going down to the park. You want to join me? Absolutely no response from the centipede. Nothing. Centipede doesn't say nothing. So Johnny goes on his way, and he's really upset at this store owner. And he's just upset. He got sold this bill of goods, and this centipede does not talk. So the following evening, Johnny thought, I'm going to give it one more try, and then I'm just going to go and chew out that pet store owner. So he goes over to the tank, and he says, hey, buddy, listen, I'm going to a restaurant. Do you want to go with me and get some food? And finally, the centipede replies and says, hey, man, I heard you the first 2 times. Will you please wait? I'm just trying to put on my shoes. Whoa. Thanks, Kenny, for sending us that joke. If you've got a joke for us, send it to us at jokes@crosswaveschurch.com, and we hope you have a fun week.